Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Great Game, Duke versus Kentucky, and the 2.1 seconds that changed basketball. By Gene Wojciechowski. Narrated by Kyle Tait. Prologue. March 28, 1992. Dick Vitale couldn't take it anymore. Nobody could. Forget manners. Forget dinner at one of his favorite Italian joints in Sarasota, Florida. Vitale had to see how this game was going to end. Had to. Because it wasn't just a game anymore. It had become a basketball passion play. Something epic. He could feel it. So he got up from his chair and made a beeline for the TV in the restaurant bar. He wasn't alone. Almost everyone else had also left their tables to watch the end of the NCAA Tournament East Regional Final in Philadelphia between number 1 ranked Duke and underdog Kentucky. Standing room only. It wasn't just the 103-102 score, the bolo-tie-thin Kentucky lead, or the 2.1 seconds left in overtime that had led them there. It was more than that. The game had made everyone in the restaurant choose sides. Vitale, the former college and NBA coach turned ESPN announcer, watched as Kentucky set up its defense. And that's when he noticed. There's nobody guarding the passer. Kentucky doesn't have anybody on the ball. Jalen Rose saw it too. The Michigan freshman point guard sat in the Wolverines team hotel in Lexington, Kentucky, site of the Southeast Regional, and stared disbelievingly at the TV screen. What the? Go find the biggest lurch on the bench and stick him in front of Grant Hill on the baseline. Jump up and down like your feet are on fire. Doesn't anybody know that Hill is right-handed? If you force him to run left on the baseline, it's going to be harder for him to make an accurate throw. P.J. Carlesimo, whose Seton Hall team had lost to Duke on the same Spectrum court 2 days earlier, watched the game from New Jersey. He was friends with both Duke's Mike Krzyzewski and Kentucky's Rick Pitino, but especially with Pitino. Still, coach is coach, even when they're watching a ball game on TV. And Carlesimo, the coach, knew Pitino was taking a gamble. In the 1989 Final Four, Carlesimo's Pirates had needed to convert a long last-second pass-and-score attempt against Michigan. Michigan coach Steve Fisher put a man on the ball and disrupted the pass attempt ever so slightly, and the Wolverines won the game. Now, Carlesimo's close friend was trying to defy history. CBS color analyst Len Elmore was courtside at the Spectrum. He saw Hill stand at the baseline, alone. Why is Kentucky giving Hill a clear view on the pass? University of Utah coach Rick Majerus sat in the sports bar of the Little America Hotel in Salt Lake City and immediately took note of Pitino's strategy. Majerus's coaching mentor, the great Al McGuire, had always said to put a guy on the ball. McGuire had a collection of tall bench-warming stiffs at Marquette that he used for that very purpose. Majerus could recite the reason by heart. It's hard to make a pressure pass with pressure on the ball. But hey, Pitino was in the East Regional Final, and Majerus was sitting on a bar stool in Salt Lake. So what did he know, right? Majerus didn't have all the answers, but he knew this. If you don't put a man on the ball, then you definitely have to force Christian Laettner, Duke's star center, who was positioned near the opposite end of the court, to work to catch the long inbounds pass. Put a guy in front of him and in back of him. Surely the Wildcats were going to do that against the All-American. Not much was at stake. Only a trip to the Final Four. That's all. Kentucky and Duke measured themselves by such standards. They wore different shades of blue and represented different constituencies, but they shared an obsession with winning not just games, but championships. Kentucky, the land-grant institution whose basketball reach stretched well beyond the borders of the Commonwealth, owned 5 NCAA championships and 37 Southeastern Conference titles, and constantly played tag with several other elite programs for most all-time victories. Duke, the prestigious private school in Durham, known for its bitter and claustrophobic basketball turf war with the University of North Carolina, didn't have the same hoops muscle mass as the Wildcats, but it did have 8 Final Four appearances, a coach whose last name was its own spelling bee, Krzywski, and a national championship won in 1991. Now, the Blue Devils, and their hopes of back-to-back titles, were 2.1 seconds away from elimination. They would need a miracle. Everybody in America, including UNLV coach Jerry Tarkanian, was positive that Hill's pass was coming to Laettner. After all, the Vegas coach knew Duke's personnel well. His Runnin' Rebels had humiliated Duke in the 1990 Final Four championship game, only to suffer a jaw-dropping defeat to Krzyzewski's team in the 1991 national semifinals. Tarkanian watched the official give the ball to Hill and whistle for play to begin. The ball came off Hill's hand. The CBS sideline camera followed its flight. So did Tarkanian and the rest of the country. He was shocked at what he saw next. They don't have a guy in front of him, thought Tarkanian. Him. Laettner. 1. Summer, 1967. The truth? The truth is, Mike Krzyzewski liked the shape of her legs. Actually, he liked her legs, loved her miniskirt, and adored her address. Chicago, his hometown. It was the summer of love. Haight-Ashbury was the capital of the hippie nation. The Counterculture Manifesto, as written by one of its founding fathers, Timothy Leary, exhorted America's youth to turn on, tune in, drop out. But love and LSD had its limits. It also was the summer of rage and riots, when cities such as Detroit and Newark burned and crackled because of the matchstick of racism, when the polarizing war in Vietnam created a deep cleft between young and old, right and left, silent majority and vocal minority. Krzyzewski was not a hippie, and definitely wasn't counterculture. He might have thought LSD was a standardized admissions test. His hair had never covered his ears, nor would it. He was a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point, a place where those who were deemed worthy were trained at taxpayer expense to become, if all went well, the best and the brightest of military officers. Duty, honor, country. Those were their core beliefs, not the drugs, sex, and rebellion that belonged to the flower children. Of course, being an army man doesn't blind you to a killer pair of legs. So when Krzyzewski stepped into the Lakeview area apartment of United Airlines stewardess Carol Marsh that summer day in '67, he couldn't help doing a subtle double-take. Marsh shared a one-bedroom apartment, located only blocks away from Wrigley Field, with another woman. Marsh's roommate happened to be the former girlfriend of one of Krzyzewski's buddies. The buddy, who was visiting Krzyzewski in Chicago, arranged to see the former girlfriend and brought Krzyzewski along as his wingman. By pure accident, Marsh was there when they arrived. Known as Mickey to her family and friends, Marsh was a Southern Baptist WASP from Virginia. Krzyzewski, also nicknamed Mick or Mickey by his boyhood pals, was a Polish Catholic from the northwest side of Chicago. He was home on leave from West Point, having just completed his second year at the academy. In West Point speak, he was no longer a third-classman, a yuck or yearling. Instead, he was transitioning to junior status, a second-classman, or cow, as they were called. It didn't take long for Krzyzewski, in his nasally Chicago accent, to ask Marsh out. For their first date, he took her to a Martha Reeves and the Vandellas concert. Marsh loved the Motown group and its conga line of rousing hits such as Heatwave, Dancing in the Street, and Jimmy Mack. There was no question the cadet had scored major style points with the attractive Marsh. His leave complete, Krzyzewski reported back to West Point, the achingly beautiful campus located along the Hudson River, about 50 miles north of New York City. He later wrote a letter to Marsh inviting her to a Chicago Bears game at Soldier Field when he returned home that fall. She accepted. It was at Soldier Field that Wojciechowski mentioned, almost as an afterthought, and with little regard for the collateral ego damage, that Marsh had been his third choice for the Bears game. She was livid. Her pride was bruised to the bone. But beyond that, her sense of competitiveness was challenged by this socially clumsy yet intriguing cadet. That clumsiness was partly the result of having attended an all-boys high school and the then all-male West Point. He simply didn't know any better. Wojciechowski was not handsome in a traditional frat boy way. His nose dominated his face, and you wouldn't use the word stylish to describe his civvies wardrobe. He wasn't a guy who'd wear a tennis sweater tied jauntily around his neck. Chances are, he didn't own a tennis sweater. But he had a confidence and an almost naive sense of right and wrong about him that attracted Marsh. His blatant honesty was part of it, she says. He would say things that people shouldn't say. Romance developed. Marsh eventually transferred to New York to be closer to Wojciechowski. Not long after visiting him at West Point, she received 9 yellow roses from him. 9? Not 12? Not red? The odd number and color choice stuck with Marsh. Months later, she asked her boyfriend why he had sent 9 yellow roses. To make you think about it, Wojciechowski said. Any guy can send you a dozen. Wojciechowski wasn't any guy. He was born, raised, and hardened in Chicago. His parents were old country Poland, as was much of the Wicker Park neighborhood where they lived. His father, William, was an elevator operator for much of his working life at the 38-story Willoughby Tower on Tony, Michigan Avenue in the Loop. His mother, Emily, was a cleaning woman at the Chicago Athletic Club. He had an older brother, Bill. Wojciechowski's father, like most of the fathers in the neighborhood, worked all the time. Not just at the Willoughby Tower, but also at the restaurant he would later own, where Mike worked mopping floors, hating every second of it. Each day was a repeat of the previous day. Work, sleep, work. The old man wasn't a drinker, but nearly every night at 7:30, you could find him walking wearily down the street to his favorite place for a cup of coffee. The relationship between the younger son and his father was occasionally sparse and trying. Wojciechowski loved his father, and the father loved his son. But the truth is, they had little in common. Mike didn't spend a whole lot of time with his dad, says Dennis Mo Malinsky, who was, and still is, Wojciechowski's best friend. There wasn't a lot to share with Mick. It wasn't a nuanced family, which helps explain Wojciechowski's unfiltered honesty. You worked. You prayed. In 6th grade, Wojciechowski decided he wanted to become a priest. You endured without complaint. There was no misunderstanding about what was expected of you. You would excel, even if that excellence was defined by the way you scrubbed a tile office floor or wore your uniform in the cramped, dreary confines of an Otis elevator. Order, discipline, respect, religion, and yes, love, were all interwoven in the Wojciechowski family DNA. So was a sense of toughness. Even the Wojciechowski name, with all those concrete, hard-sounding consonants, projected a certain no-nonsense ruggedness. Wojciechowski was always a leader, beginning with his schoolyard friends known as the Columbos. Mick was the one who organized the 7th and 8th grade basketball league. Mick was the one who organized everything. He didn't seem older than his friends, just more assertive. He became a star athlete and star student at Weber High School, an all-boys Catholic school run by the priests and brothers of the Resurrectionist Order in the city's predominantly Polish and Italian neighborhoods on the near northwest side. His resume was impressive. National Honor Society member, senior class vice president, and captain of the Red Horde basketball team. Wojciechowski wasn't necessarily one of the most popular students. Football players were first on the Weber food chain. But his classmates and teachers were aware of his potential. There were high expectations for him, says Mike Simplensky, who was the team manager during Wojciechowski's sophomore and junior seasons. People were demanding of him to perform at his highest level. This wasn't uncommon at Weber. Students with solid B averages in a subject would occasionally be flunked for a 6-week grading period if the teacher thought they were capable of A-level work. Nor did you dare challenge the traditions and conventions of the school. White shirts and ties were mandatory. Students were required each day to load all of their textbooks in a satchel, bring them home, and return with them the next morning. You couldn't study, reasoned the priests, if your books were in your locker. Corporal punishment was administered regularly, swiftly, and without bias. One priest carried a miniature Louisville Slugger bat with him as he patrolled the hallways. If he saw a student with his hands in his pockets, the priest would crack the bat against the student's shoulder and say, "What are you doing? Taking inventory? You've only got 2. One of the priests, a former wrestler who taught Latin, once called 2 students up to the front of his classroom after he had caught them not paying attention to his lecture. He grabbed each of them by the collar and hung them on hooks attached to the blackboard. They dangled there for several minutes, until the priest sent them back to their seats. Wojciechowski didn't mind Weber's strictness or discipline. He liked order, and a system in which effort was rewarded. He had embraced basketball after a failed tryout for the Weber football team. It was the first time as an athlete he had ever been told he wasn't good enough. Wojciechowski loathed failure. He despised losing, and had a legendary bad temper to prove it. So, he turned to basketball, a sport that he could practice by himself and constantly invent scenarios in which he'd make the game-winning jump shot or the game-winning free throw. And if he missed the free throw, he'd imagine a lane violation on the opposing team, giving him a second chance. "It was much more than a game to me, and always has been," he said. His parents understood little about sports, but they understood that their youngest son thrived in a culture that emphasized work ethic, competition, will, and structure. And they approved. It didn't matter that Bill and Emily were unfamiliar with, or even uninterested in, this distinctly American game. They supported their sons, as they always had. If that meant Emily would tend to the house during the day, and then clean offices at night, so her boys could afford to go to Catholic schools, then so be it. Meanwhile, for years, no more than 2 dresses would ever hang in her closet. Always, family first. Wojciechowski was good, but not great at basketball. He became the team's starting point guard, and the Chicago Catholic League's leading scorer as a junior and senior. But, says Simplensky, he was a little bit slow on defense. He was consumed by the game, and took defeat personally, as if somehow it was his fault whenever Weber lost. He was always a high-effort player, but no matter the ferocity or outcome of the game, he was also the first player to seek out his opponent for a post-game handshake. But Wojciechowski was often his own harshest critic. Coach would be screaming at him from the sidelines, and Mike would be beside himself because he felt he didn't execute, says Simplensky. As his high school career was nearing its end, Wojciechowski faced the always important decision about where to go to college. His ultimate choice would have lifelong ramifications, since it brought him into the orbit of a hyper-intense 25-year-old coach named Bob Knight. Compared to the absurd fawning and attention showered on today's high school prospects, Knight's recruitment of Wojciechowski was almost skeletal. They sat in the Weber cafeteria, ate sandwiches, and discussed Wojciechowski's future. Later that night, the young Army coach visited Bill and Emily at the apartment on West Cortez Street. Knight wanted players who were committed, tough, and mentally nimble. He needed them to be able to translate his basketball theory and language to the court. Wojciechowski could do that. But West Point wasn't his first choice, or second, or third. He wanted to stay closer to home and play for a school in the Big Ten Conference. Creighton, the Jesuit university located in Omaha, Nebraska, was also on Wojciechowski's short list. So, he told Knight no. It was an astounding decision, mostly because Wojciechowski had few options. Exactly 0 Big Ten programs were actively recruiting him, or would. Creighton also took a pass. A coach from the University of Detroit Mercy was interested in signing him, and asked Wojciechowski to meet him on the south side of the city, all the way down at 95th and Western. Wojciechowski, insulted that the coach wasn't willing to visit him or his family, immediately ended the recruitment. But his dismissal of the West Point opportunity confounded his parents the most. This nice young Coach Knight had traveled all the way from New York to offer their son a chance to attend the United States Military Academy. Just think, a Wojciechowski at West Point. And he hadn't jumped at the chance? How could their son be such a bright boy, and yet so foolish? Didn't he understand that his own parents had no high school diplomas? That a Polish surname was considered a liability? Wojciechowski's father was so sensitive about his immigrant status and the stigma of being categorized as a DP, for displaced person, or dumb Polak, as they were derisively called, that he often used Bill Cross as an alias. Neither of the two Wojciechowski boys was taught or encouraged to speak Polish in the house, for fear that they would develop Polish accents. One of the finest educational institutions in the country, perhaps the world, wanted him to join its elite club, and he didn't want in? This wasn't merely an opportunity. It was a social advantage. A rarity, if you were a Wojciechowski. Dennis Malinsky's family lived a block and a half away, on Levitt Street. One day, as they sat on the fence outside Malinsky's apartment building, Wojciechowski mentioned that his parents were pressuring him to attend West Point. "West Point?" said Malinsky. "Where's that? Isn't that the school where all the presidents went to?" Wojciechowski heard his parents' conversations around the kitchen table, where they would sit each morning and discuss the topic of the day. These days, it was impossible not to hear them chattering away in Polish, and then, for their son's benefit, lapsing briefly into English and saying, "Stupid Mike," just so there wasn't any confusion about the thrust of the conversation and their stance on the issue. After 2 weeks of listening to his parents' unsubtle urging, Wojciechowski relented. He couldn't disappoint Bill and Emily, especially Emily. Family first. "I'll go to West Point," he told them. "I'll do it." The U.S. Military Academy can be a place of profound loneliness, pressure, and incalculable stress. And it was all those for Wojciechowski. He went to West Point, but he almost didn't stay. Several times during his first year, he considered quitting and returning to Chicago. He missed his family and friends, but he especially missed his freedom. When Malinsky and another friend visited him during his plebe year, Wojciechowski was waiting for them at the gate in his cadet uniform, tears somersaulting down his cheeks. He was so happy to see a friend, Malinsky says. Wojciechowski was accustomed to discipline. His family and a Catholic education had made sure of that. He understood the need for boundaries and rules. But what he didn't understand, and what he would come to resent, even hate at West Point, were rules written without involving those who would have to abide by them. He didn't see the logic of it. He survived his first year, and as time passed, his occasional urge to quit and go home faded. Basketball helped. During his 3 varsity seasons at Army, Wojciechowski was never among the team's leading scorers, averaging 5.3 points as a sophomore, 6.4 as a junior, 6.7 as a senior. He wasn't the Black Knights' best player, but he might have been their most dependable. He was consistent, but not flashy. He was controlled and efficient, but there was nothing that suggested basketball artistry. He was an extension of Knight, which is to say, he was a mouse on a treadmill, always chasing after perfection and never letting up. In Wojciechowski, Knight found someone who shared his craving for excellence. It was hard to say which drove them most, the longing for victory or the dread and ache of defeat. Wojciechowski, more than any other player on the Army roster, could handle Knight's furnace blasts of criticism and anger. He knew Knight was using him as a conduit to the rest of the team, accepted his role as the designated yellee, and separated the message from the messenger, like slag from iron ore. In the 1967, 68, and 69 Army team photos, there is no hint of a smile on Krzyzewski's black and white face. He wore Chuck Taylors and a look of determination. In his junior year, Army recorded its first-ever 20-win regular season and earned a berth in the National Invitation Tournament, when the NIT still meant something. The next season, with Krzyzewski as senior captain, the Black Knights won 18 games, including a 54-52 win against Bradley at the Kentucky Invitational Tournament on December 20th. Krzyzewski hit 2 late free throws, despite an injured eye, to clinch the victory. The next evening, after a 15-point loss to Kentucky in the championship game, Knight kicked a locker in anger and spat on the second-place trophy in disgust. Happy holidays. Army again was selected for the NIT and reached the semifinals. No small feat for a service academy. It remains the second-best ever postseason showing for Army. At least as important, Army beat Navy, as it had during each of Krzyzewski's 3 seasons on the varsity. After that victory against the midshipmen, on Saturday, March 1, 1969, Krzyzewski was presented with the game ball. Later that same day, a phone call came from Chicago. His father had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. William Krzyzewski was dead by the time Mike could get home. Bob Knight, who preached loyalty to his players, now practiced it. He left the team and followed his senior captain back to the Chicago apartment where he had recruited Krzyzewski, or, more accurately, Krzyzewski's parents. Knight stayed for 3 days. He sat with the grieving Emily for hours at a time in the family kitchen. It was as if nothing else mattered to him right then, other than helping my mom and me, Krzyzewski told author John Feinstein years later. Bill's death rocked the family, but Knight's presence was a godsend, and something Krzyzewski would never forget. Knight had been unbearably hard on Krzyzewski, but that was basketball. When it truly mattered, Knight was there for him and his family. On the afternoon of June 4, 1969, Bill Krzyzewski's younger son, the one who had been reluctant to even consider West Point, received his Bachelor of Science degree, his second lieutenant bars, and his wedding ring. Graduation ceremony at noon, marriage ceremony at the West Point Chapel at 5. His brother Bill Jr. was the best man, and Malinsky was in the wedding party. Krzyzewski presented Malinsky with a miniature bust of a West Point cadet as a present. Emily watched proudly as the newly commissioned officer and his wife Mickey exited the chapel, walking under an arch of shined silver sabers, to begin their lives together. Krzyzewski served in the U.S. Army for 5 years and resigned as a captain in 1974. He liked the Army, but he loved basketball more. He then enlisted as a graduate assistant on Knight's Indiana University coaching staff for the 75 season. He was 26, married with a young daughter. It was the beginning of a coaching odyssey. What I recognized that year was how all-consuming the job is, says Mickey, who slowly sanded down some of the jagged edges of Krzyzewski's personality. The family can be put on the back burner forever and ever, and you end up not being together. I told him that if this was going to be his career, I was going to be part of it. He agreed, but this was a time when women didn't get to be part of that. At West Point, Coach Dan Daugherty was putting the finishing touches on a 3-22 season. Wins only against Scranton, Iona, and Pitt Johnstown, that would cost him his job. Thanks to both power broker Knight's recommendation and Krzyzewski's convincing interview, Army hired one of its own. Krzyzewski's 1976 Army team finished 11-14. The program he had just left, Indiana, went undefeated and won the national championship. In 1977, Krzyzewski's Black Knights won 20 games and followed it up with 19 victories and an NIT appearance in 1978. He was a coach on the rise. And then he wasn't. Army won 14 games in 1979.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?